Today, we're going to talk about stevia. Is it bad for our gut health? So let's talk a little bit about some background. Sugar substitutes are used to reduce sugar intake. There's a lot of people out there like me. Bread used to be one of my major sources of calories prior to going low carb. I'd leaned plant-based. I've never been a vegan or a vegetarian, but I've experimented with those diets, never with any commitment, but with the goal of just demonstrating what they were like. I've actually, for example, demonstrated clearly that you can go on a full diet with vegetarian or vegan. Most people assume, with the keto diet, you have to be eating a lot of bacon and red meats, etc. That's not the case. Now, for the majority of my adult life, probably age 30 till the mid-50s, I tended to eat mostly plant-based and got a lot of carbs from breads. I never liked pastas, but I did love breads. I've had no problem getting breads out of my diet or the grains, but I've had major problems getting sweets out of my diet. If you look at it, for the typical American carb-laden diet, most of us do get far more carbs out of grain products than we do sugars. So when I'm working with patients, that's one of the things I bring up. First of all, let's just try to get the grain products out of your diet. Most people, when they hear their doctor tells them, oh, you got a touch of sugar, the first reaction for most people is, well, don't put as much sugar in your coffee. And it's like, that's really majoring in the minors. The grain products are the place to focus first. But the grain products don't have as much of an addictive quality as sweets do. Excess sugar consumption can cause weight gain, lead to diabetes, contribute to cardiovascular inflammation. Various substitutes, pardon the misspelling, various substitutes, artificial and natural, are available. Sucralose, aspartame, saccharin, xylitol, erythritol. Even back in the dark ages when I was at Hopkins, the discoveries about saccharin causing bladder cancer were just hit the science airwaves. And there was a lot of concern. At Hopkins, we do what we call denominator medicine, meaning we don't just look at a story here or a story there. We look at what are the numbers. And that's one of the things that sometimes makes our content boring, because we look at the numbers. We weigh the benefits, weigh the risks. And the reality was, I remember us talking about the actual numbers. You had diabetics that were using a lot of saccharin at that time. And the question was, should they go back to sugar? Was it that bad of a deal? And the issue was, no. When you looked at the actual doses that the rats were given to cause bladder cancer with saccharin, it was like a pickup truck load full of saccharin. Humans are bigger than mice. It was demonstrated in mice. So even then, those of us who were into the numbers, the statistics, the denominator medicine, really were not that worried about saccharin. So then you get aspartame and concerns about urinary tract irritation and headaches and other things with aspartame, sucralose, xylitol, erythritol. This point, xylitol is GI irritation. Just look that up if you have any interest in that. Erythritol would probably take precedence for most people in the know in terms of safety, even over stevia. But erythritol, you're not going to find erythritol in a lot of products because erythritol is expensive. Stevia is more expensive than the others, but it's not as expensive as erythritol. And let me just break from the script for a second and give one other personal comment. I've mentioned before that it's helpful to use a thing called the sugar blocker. We'll talk about that a little bit later. That's been one of the better ways for me. It's an old Ayurvedic medicine. And I brought it up before thinking of the name, so now I can't remember the name. Somebody help me with fact checking on that. The bottom line, though, is that continued use of the sugar blocker, the Ayurvedic medicine that actually blocks sweets receptors, and continued focus, I've been able to hold that sweets addiction at bay. But it's sort of like alcohol and Alcoholics Anonymous when they say, once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. To me, once a strong sweets addict, always a strong sweets addict. Have struggled with that for decades, and I don't see myself ever completely overcoming that. But I do eat a lot fewer sweets than I used to. I used to drink, in the past, I would run half marathon just for training in 95-degree weather, and instead of drinking water, I would drink a lot of Diet Coke. I'm not doing that anymore. Maybe it's a little success, but it's a successful step. Let's go back to the script. Is stevia the perfect replacement for sugar? Stevia rawbiddiana, easy for me to say, huh? It's a plant-based sweetener option. It's a native from a stevia plant in South America, Brazil, and Paraguay. It's 300 times sweeter than table sugar and has 0 calories. The glycemic index is less than 1. You know, a lot of people say, well, these, quote, sweeteners actually have high glycemic index. Now, that would be true for, obviously, clearly honey, which is fructose. It's not a replacement. I don't remember if monk fruit has that. There's a couple of others, though, that are thought of, and the general consideration is that they're a sugar substitute, but they have significant glycemic index. Now, none of the ones that we have here, I don't believe any of these, sucralose, aspartame, saccharin, xylitol, and erythritol, I don't think any of those have any kind of significant glycemic index. For those of you who are asking, what's a glycemic index? It's reaction of a food to make your blood sugar elevate. So if you eat something, if you eat a tablespoon of sugar, your blood sugar is going to rise. It's actually got a glycemic index of about, what, in the 60s? And while we're talking about glycemic index, I have to give that common example. People think, well, Brewer, you just don't know what you're talking about. Whole grains are great for you. It's the processed grains. I would agree that processed grains are worse, but look up the glycemic index for whole grain bread and white bread. I think with white bread, you'll see something in the 70s, maybe even higher than a teaspoon of sugar. For whole grain bread, it'll be something like the 60s, which is pretty equivalent to sugar. So whole grain foods are not low carb. Hate to tell you that if you're thinking that, but it's something you clearly need to know. Now, why are we worried about the gut microbiota? Well, what is the gut? Well, when we're talking about the gut, for the most part, we're talking about the large intestine, somewhat the small intestine, but mostly the large intestine. And microbiota, micro meaning microscopic, biota meaning the living things in your large intestine. There are more living cells. Amazing the number and mass of living cells that we have in our gut. And as you begin to look at things like depression, appetite, diabetes and prediabetes, you begin to realize it's not just that we are a place for these bacteria to live. They're sometimes doing our thinking for us. They have a big impact on our behavior. They also have a big impact on our health. Let me give you an example before we get back to the slide. So this was discovered and has been confirmed multiple ways. Fecal transplants, yes, taking feces from one person to another person, that's been found to be by far the best treatment for Clostridium difficile, one of our biggest problems with gut biota, but also other things as well. They actually first discovered that with lab models, lab rats, where they did gut fecal transplants. If they did a fecal transplant from an animal that had diabetes or even prediabetes, the recipient animal went to great risk of developing diabetes or prediabetes. So obviously meaning something in that gut biota is driving diabetes and prediabetes. Well, that does clearly appear to be true. There's obviously a lot more to learn in that space, but there's no question that that's the case. In fact, if you look and characterize the gut biota of someone with diabetes versus prediabetes, you'll see a very, very different set of bugs in there. A lot of the differences have to do with a set called Bacteroides. There'll be no test on that, but that's for the geeks. So the other thing that you'll see is instead of a broad spectrum of different types of bacteria, with diabetes and prediabetes, a lot of these side groups die off, and you get a much thinner series of species within the gut biome. So one of the questions about, I'll just connect one other dot and then I'll get back to the script. So one of the questions about metformin, about 20% of us, once we start taking metformin, have gas and even diarrhea for up to a couple of weeks. And then that calms down for 99% of us. Now, there are some genetic variations of us as humans where we just continue to have problems with metformin. But by far, the majority of people are able to take metformin. Now, we know, this brings up a question about metformin and the mechanism. We know that metformin slows down the liver's gluconeogenesis. Glucose, new genesis. In other words, creation of new glucose. The liver will cleave glycogen, which is a chain link version conversion of glucose and dump that glucose into the bloodstream in response to things like cortisol or epinephrine. Metformin slows that down. Now, we've always assumed that was the major mechanism of metformin, but metformin tends to have a much longer term impact. And I personally wonder if it's related to this gut biota issue and the symptoms. Because another thing that you'll see as someone continues to take metformin is that they'll go from that very narrow set of gut biota species to that much broader, flatter set. So again, as you can see, now I'm starting to take bunny holes from my own slides. Can't help it. Back to the slide. The digestive system is home to various types of bacteria. Some of them may help to prevent inflammation, protect against certain types of cancer, reduce symptoms associated with rheumatoid arthritis, and as I mentioned before, prevent diabetes, prevent depression, a lot of things. The gut bacteria can communicate with each other through different signaling molecules. This mechanism is called quorum sensing. Maybe a geeky term, but just need to remember it for about 5 more minutes and then you can forget it if you want to. Quorum sensing is important in terms of microbial regulation. That's actually what the article was about that we're covering today. Now, how can we maintain a healthy gut? Biggest issue is not to do with any non-nutritive sweeteners, it's antibiotics. For years I was the chief medical officer for MDLIVE, and we had about 700 docs. During flu season or allergy season, it seemed like everybody and their kids and their aunt and their uncle and their dog would call up and say, "Doc, I got a cold, I need an antibiotic." We went through decades of that in medicine in the United States, just ripping up people's gut biome and had no clue. Now we know better, but not everybody knows better. Groups like MDLIVE are still getting hammered during allergy and flu season with people inappropriately and dangerously assuming that an antibiotic is going to solve allergies or a viral illness. Be careful if you're one of those folks. Think about it, read up on it. I don't entirely agree with this next comment. I agree entirely with the first half. Avoid processed foods. This assumption about avoiding red meat, that has come into a lot of question, especially if you go back and you look at the Nina Teichholz's book, The Big Fat Surprise. Talks a lot about that. And I did a YouTube live, about a year ago on it. Maybe we should do an update where basically JACC, the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, published a lit review, a summary of all of the research out there about saturated fat. Basically what it showed was those of us who think saturated fat is hurting us, the evidence does not support that. Now, is there more to red meat than saturated fat? We can debate that some other time. Let's get back to the slide. Taking probiotics does appear to help. For the past decade or so, those of us who are in prevention assume that constant recurring population of our gut with maybe the Bacteroides species, it's not bacillus. Somebody help me again with, I'm blanking on the species that you tend to find in probiotics. The assumption is that those help. Now, the downside is, are they actually making it there? Are those actually helping? There are those of us who would say, maybe just continuing to put the lactobacillus species, especially in dried or powdered form, spore form, is that really helping? You could use things like yogurt. The problem with the yogurts and most fermented foods is that they've got so much sugar. Now, sauerkraut doesn't. Kimchi tends to not have it. So maybe those are helpful. But again, there are those of us who would say it's not populating the gut. It's giving the gut bacteria something that they can eat. In other words, fiber. So lots of concepts, lots of debates about that. Now let's get to the article itself. Anti-quorum sensing activity of stevia extract, stevioside, ribadioside A, and their aglycon steviol. The point was stevia is generally considered to be safe. However, there's some emerging scientific evidence that implicates this and gut microbial imbalance. Now, where was this done? Ben Gurion University. There's been a good bit of research around the non-nutritive sweeteners and their impact on gut health in Israel. Ben Gurion's one of the places that's been doing a lot of it. They evaluated the effects of bacteria, communication of impact of commercial stevia, herbal supplement, and purified stevia extracts, as I mentioned before. Stevioside, ribadioside A, Reb A, and steviol. The assessment was performed using a model of of a recombinant bioluminescent E. coli strain. So this strain interacts with a reactive compound which induces light production. That sounds interesting. So obviously they're looking at gut bacteria, poop, and seeing if what the impact of light production is on these stevia products. The effects of adding the stevia products were tested based on that light interaction. The concentration ranges for the stevia compounds were calculated to reflect concentration ranges within the acceptable daily intake from groups like FAO and the WHO. The researchers reported stevia herbal supplement and purified extracts had inhibitory effects on bacterial communication. In other words, the lights went out on the poop. The purified stevia extract showed molecular interaction and possibly interruption of some of the forms of bacterial communication. Stevia did not cause gut bacteria direct damage in any case. These results suggest that considerable consumption of stevia may disrupt the microbial balance. There's a need for further safety studies on the agents. You know, they always say that at the end of every study. There's a need for further study. Well, maybe they're thinking that they might be the guys that get funded to do some of that further study. Now, that's true, but you know, I did a lot of my own research. I always ended that way too. The point is not so much to try to get more funding for yourself. The point is, after you spend that kind of effort researching something, number one, you're not going to research if you don't think it's important. Number two, as you get deeper and deeper into the question, it's sort of like that old adage, every solution creates a whole new set of problems. Well, they got us some answers here, but every answer creates a whole new set of questions.
Continue to get great feedback regarding the webinars, and here's why. You know, on the internet, when you hear a webinar, you expect for somebody to try to sell you something. We're not doing that. We're trying to tell you something. People are coming in with their labs from Quest, inflammation panel, OGTT, insulin survey response, and then they're finding out, do I have inflammation? Do I have insulin resistance? And where does that fit in terms of other folks? We're getting ready to start one for CINT as well. So again, people are really excited about finding out their own status. Looking forward to seeing you there. Thanks.